What's going on, everyone? I'm just a typical, average American here today to react and learn about what America would be like if we had lost the revolution against Great Britain. Who knows where we'd be right now, honestly? Who knows where I would be? I'd probably have a British accent. That'd be kind of cool, but I just thought this sounded like such an interesting look into an alternate history that very well could have happened. So, with that being said, let's take a look.
The ultimate underdogs, led by George Washington, turned back the forces of Great Britain and created a new country, the United States of America.
Yeah.
But what if it didn't work out that way? 700 British soldiers had been sent to destroy colonial supplies and cut off the rebellion before it could start. Warning was given by Paul Revere and the other riders of the British arrival. But in this timeline, a stray butterfly spooked the horses of the warning team, keeping them from ever reaching their destinations.
What? Wait. Okay, this is where it all begins. So in this timeline, we are saying that Paul Revere, who is a very famous person in American history, Paul Revere famously, chanted, the British are coming, the British are coming, and gave us that intel that helped us, shift the tides of this conflict. So if Paul Revere had never been able to give that warning to the rest of the American colonials, this is what would have happened instead.
The British swept in and captured the arms caches and arrested the ringleaders planning to fight the British. Prominent founding fathers like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin were interrogated by the British, likely disavowing all involvement, but one thing was sure: there would not be an American Revolution in this timeline.
This is so bizarre to listen to. Particularly as an American, they're literally talking about some of the United States founding fathers, as we call them, and how they're being captured and interrogated, which is very, very bizarre to hear about. like that's what happened. Well, it is what happened in this story, this timeline anyway. Wow.
Under the hard-nosed approach by King George III, the potential revolution had been quelled.
Put these Americans in prison and feed them tea with no biscuits. How cruel. Wow, so, man, according to this, Paul Revere not warning the other Americans about the British coming would have had, a super, major impact and maybe have stopped the American Revolution in its tracks right then and there, and all of the American leaders are just captured already and thrown in prison in this scenario.
And he would likely take care to make sure it never repeated. British troops would maintain a strong presence in the colonies, rooting out any sign of rebellion. George was infamous as the king who had the harshest approach toward the colonies, spurring increased resistance, but it's likely that after a close call, he might have been advised by those he trusts to hold off on any new taxes for a while. After all, the colonies were a valuable resource, so it's likely that the status quo would have remained in place for the next few decades, as long as George III remained in power.
Interesting. So yeah, that's definitely true. If the British had managed to stop us, right at the beginning of our attempted revolution, the British, monarch would have definitely, paid much, much closer attention and probably would have, enforced a lot of new laws and put a lot of soldiers in place to make sure this sort of rebellion attempt never happened again. But also maybe like they're saying, the British would have tried to make us, American colonists, a little more happy, reduce taxes, maybe listen to some of the grievances that we had that started the whole revolution idea. So that's interesting to think about, actually. For the sake of longevity, there probably would have been some sort of negotiations or something to try to make the American colonists a little happier if they were going to remain part of the British Empire.
And that would be a while. George III had a reputation of being a bit of a disaster, but he was actually the longest reigning king in British history, serving for almost 60 years. His successor, George IV, was seen as a dilettante who only reigned for 10 years. Selfish and irresponsible, his reign was heavily influenced by his advisors, and as such, it's likely they just would have advised him to keep things going under his father's colonial policies for the term. After all, there were parties to attend back in London.
I don't know that much about the different British kings and queens throughout history, I gotta be honest. So this king in particular was like just almost like a figurehead. Like, is it their advisors basically ran the show, so they would have just kept things the same, basically.
Back in the colonies, things have changed a lot. Many of the founding fathers who defined the march to independence have since passed away, with Franklin and Washington likely not having anywhere near the influence on history they did in our timeline.
That's so crazy. This is so crazy to hear about. It's bizarre, I tell you. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, like, these are the people that we learn about in our American history classes growing up. And thinking about how in this timeline, like, they would just be somewhat insignificant, honestly. How many, like, famous rebellion leaders do people remember when the rebellion failed, when the revolution failed and was stopped in its tracks? Who remembers the leaders of those revolutions, you know? So George Washington and Ben Franklin history probably wouldn't even remember them.
Timeline. However, it's likely an independence-minded movement continues in the colonies, focused less on fighting for independence than on developing the colony's culture. And they have a lot of room to do it in. While the original United States post-revolution was only composed of 13 colonies, the British territories they're part of now are much larger, including much of what's now Canada. And the crisis happening in another country might be as big a factor as what's happening in England.
Oh, interesting. So at this time, it sounds like even if America had failed our revolution and we were still part of Great Britain, like, we still would have, you know, because we're pretty far away across the ocean, we still would have maintained some semblance of, like, independence, sort of. Just not in a violent or, like, conflict, not some kind of big conflict happening, not in a violent manner. That's interesting, and I guess because Great Britain was having conflict with France anyway, there was, like, other things to worry about than the American colonists.
While the American Revolution didn't happen in this timeline, odds are another revolution did, the French Revolution. The circumstances there were primarily driven by poverty and populist rage against an out-of-touch monarch. And while it's possible that the American events helped to influence it, they also quickly spiraled out of control, and the Americans who supported it in our timeline were rather ineffectual at pushing it in their direction. And some were even imprisoned for their efforts. So odds are...
Really? We're talking about the French Revolution. I don't know anything about the French Revolution, actually.
That Danton and Robespierre still rose, and the king and Marie Antoinette still wound up facing Madame Guillotine. And the Reign of Terror still sent France into chaos until it fell, leading to the rise of Emperor Napoleon. And that would give Britain the leverage it needed. France and Britain have long been bitter enemies, and in our timeline, both saw their empires decline significantly in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Britain saw itself lose its colonies, while France lost much of its territory to Britain in the 7 Years' War. That gave Britain a dominant foothold in North America, including control of the French-speaking territory of Quebec. So with France relegated to rump territory in the continent and dealing with political upheaval, odds are that Britain would have been able to take America's place in the Louisiana Purchase in the early 1800s.
Wow. History would have been very, very different if things had played out like this. Britain would have, like, expanded and taken our place, like America's place, in expanding across, like, a pretty good part of North America, the continent, and it would just be a giant hunk of Great Britain instead, like that.
Giving the country near total dominance of North America with only Spain to oppose it. But the dominant country would be able to face a major challenge. The United States' history was largely one of expansion for most of its first 70 years, but a major crisis was brewing: slavery. The new country chose to keep the oppressive institution to appease the southern states, although it did abolish the slave trade in 1807. This just led to it creating harsher rules to keep its enslaved population in perpetual bondage. It wasn't until the 1860s, after a brutal civil war, that the United States abolished slavery, and even then it was over a century before the system of racial oppression in the South would be addressed.
Interesting. Are they trying to say that if America had never won its independence, like the history of slavery in America might have gone differently?
But in this timeline, things would be very different. You might think that under a colonial power, progress might be even slower. After all, Britain helped bring the institution of slavery to the continent of North America, along with other colonial powers. But actually, the slave trade was abolished in Great Britain the same year as it was in the United States, and pressure continued amongst abolitionist members of Parliament to eliminate the institution for good.
Oh, I didn't know that. I had no idea. Is that a coincidence? Or, like, what's that about? That can't just be coincidence, right? Slavery was abolished in Great Britain the same exact year that it was abolished in America? So maybe, like, as far as slavery is concerned, things would have been pretty similar? Because in this scenario, we are part of Great Britain, and slavery would be abolished roughly the same year, huh?
The result was that in 1833, Great Britain passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which eliminated the possession of slaves in the country and all territories controlled by it, with the exception of those managed by the East India Company. That included the massive North America territories. So how does this play out across the pond? The abolition of slavery in the UK went relatively smoothly because Great Britain was not an agricultural-driven market. It was a relatively small island nation quickly becoming a hub of India. The United States might not have been independent at this point, but odds are its territorial breakdown is still fairly similar. You have the industrialized northern states and the more agricultural southern states, which are making much more heavy use of slaves. And as word starts to spread that the institution might be coming to an end, odds are we'd see some rebellion.
I see. Interesting. I've never thought about it like this. Slavery was deemed more necessary in the United States because of our different industries, specifically with farming and agriculture and the use of slavery in that trade. So in that sense, like, Americans back then might have fought harder to keep slavery because they thought it affected them more and affected our economy more. Whereas in Great Britain, those industries weren't as important, nor the use of slavery, like, economically speaking. Very interesting. Very touchy subject. Interesting to think about, though.
And instead of a civil war, it's time for the American Revolution 2.0?
They actually think that trying to abolish... If Great Britain tried to abolish slavery in the American colonies that, in this scenario, are still part of Great Britain, the American colonies would have tried to start a revolution because of that. So this is Revolution 2.0. This is like a different reason why America might have tried to fight for its independence to keep slavery. That's rather dark, isn't it? That's terrible. Oh my God, I hope we lose this. I hope we also lose this pretend hypothetical Revolution 2.0, actually, hearing that.
This could have been very different if the United States lost an extended revolution back in the 1770s, but in this timeline, it was crushed with relatively little effort by the British. That means that the colonies would have been allowed to develop at their own pace under the oversight of the Crown.
We were crushed easily, apparently. Fair enough. And then what? Like, over time, I do believe it would have just become normalized. Like, yeah, we're like the American colonies, we're part of Great Britain, like, and we have voting rights, and we're British citizens. Like, that would have just been normal. That just would be how it is.
And they likely have all their own governors and local political figures. It's impossible to know if someone who is a governor or a senator in the U.S. would still be prominent here, but there are some figures who are such major players who are so determined to make their voices heard that it's almost impossible to imagine they wouldn't emerge in any circumstance.
Interesting. So they're actually saying, in this hypothetical scenario, like, America would have been given, like, a pretty big degree of independence to do its own thing. Probably very similar to, like Canada, and I think Australia might have been, like, a British colony at one point. There's a lot of parts of the world that used to be part of the British Empire that technically still have that connection to this day, but are very, very independent and very much considered their own nation. That seems like the most likely thing that would have happened here in the United States, going down that sort of route, huh?
And so enters John C. Calhoun into the fray. The fiery South Carolina radical rose to prominence in the United States as the only vice president to lead a rebellion against his own president, supporting South Carolina in a dispute with the federal government over tariffs. He would later emerge as one of the most prominent figures in the lead-up to the Civil War, refusing any concessions to abolitionists and advocating for secession if the institution of slavery was infringed upon.
Interesting. They're actually arguing that really, really important American figures like John Calhoun would have still ended up doing something important in this alternate timeline. I'm not sure if that's how, like, time travel or altering history really works. I mean, if all of this crazy stuff happened differently, John C. Calhoun probably wouldn't have even been born, because too many things would have been changed, you know? But we don't gotta get into all that kind of complicated stuff.
He would die 10 years before the Civil War began, but his fiery speech in Congress is seen by many as the turning point where conflict was inevitable. And in this timeline, the crisis over slavery happened several decades earlier. Instead of being a dying old war horse in 1850, Calhoun is a hale fire breather of 51 in 1833, when the word of the Slavery Abolition Act filters down from Parliament.
So in this timeline, John C. Calhoun is a lot younger when this Slavery Abolitionist Act from Great Britain gets sent down to the American colonies, and we're very, very upset about it, including John C. Calhoun.
He's a powerhouse in South Carolina colonial politics, perhaps even the governor, and he proved that he was anything but shy when it came to opposing the government. So odds are good that when the attempt to persuade the Crown out of passing the bill failed, he would be ready to defy them and try to create the Confederacy 30 years early.
Oh, so this could have led to the American Civil War 2.0. Right, I forgot. Yeah, like the American Civil War happened after America became independent, but in this timeline, America is still part of Great Britain, and maybe the American colonies are still split ideologically over slavery, so there's like an American colony civil war going on. And then wouldn't, like, Great Britain support, like, the northern colonies who want to follow this anti-slavery act? And this is interesting to think about.
But this would be a very different conflict.
Yeah.
The map of the country looks a little different in this timeline.
look at this freaking map. Oh my god. Yeah. So in this timeline, like, the United States and all of Canada are just part of the United Kingdom,
with the much larger territory of Canada joining it. However, it's unlikely that Great Britain would have been quite as involved in the southern border and looking to take territory from Spain. So it's possible that Texas would not be a part of the United States. This means the Confederacy is little more than a rump state consisting of the southern states from Virginia to Florida, against one of the biggest empires the world has ever seen. Well,
yeah, this is what I was thinking. Like, if there was an American Civil War, it'd be like this really, really tiny part of America that's trying to keep slavery around, and they'd probably get defeated very easily and quickly, instead of the long, drawn-out Civil War that we had in reality.
Well, in the U.S. Civil War, the two territories were relatively even, with the Confederacy winning key early victories and even making inroads into the North in places like Pennsylvania. The odds are this time the war goes much more quickly, because the British are coming. The early rebellion would
Right.
likely be fierce and take colonists by surprise. The odds are the Southern troops might be able to take some territory to defend their region, because the North would not be expecting a fight from their fellow colonies. But when word got back to the Crown about what was going on, they
Yeah.
would be likely to respond fiercely. While
Yeah.
the United Kingdom stayed neutral in the Civil War and even considered giving aid to the Confederacy to weaken their old enemies, this time the whole force of the British Empire would be bearing down on the rebels, and the
Yeah.
man in charge would have a big role in it. George IV passed away in 1830 and left no heirs, so his successor was William IV, his younger brother, and one of the oldest monarchs to ever take the throne at 65. But
This is so interesting because now in this timeline, all of like this American history craziness that happened after we became independent, suddenly the British Empire has to care about it. Suddenly the British Empire has to care if the American colonies are getting into a civil war and all this stuff. It's interesting.
while he only reigned for 7 years due to his age, he was one of the most consequential kings of the era. A reformer and a strong leader, he approved of the abolition of slavery and also restricted child labor and improved the welfare system.
Nice.
However, he believed in keeping the British Empire strong and would not take well to a rebellion. And the Second American Revolution would go down just like the first. The early successes of the Southern Rebellion would be short-lived, as reinforcements streamed over from Great Britain and delivered arms and soldiers.
Yeah, this is exactly what I thought like would happen in this scenario. Like the forces from mainland Britain, I don't know what we would call it, like as American colonies, maybe it would be like the motherland. Send forces from the motherland. They would just help like quell the rebels who wanted to keep slavery very, very quickly and easily, I imagine.
Colonial resistance would be met with far superior forces, and the odds are that the Southern slaveholders would suffer heavy losses early on. William IV would perhaps offer them a chance to surrender, a wise move, but Calhoun, as the ringleader of the rebellion, would be unlikely to take the olive branch, so his army would go down in flames, and the British crown would be unlikely to deal as kindly with him as the United States did with Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, bringing an end to the institution of slavery in the American colonies.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I like, it's hard to sit here and like imagine all these hypothetical scenarios of what history would possibly be like if America had lost the revolution. But all of this stuff actually seems like pretty reasonable to like when you actually think about the different pathways that could have happened. So we would have had our Civil War. It would have been stopped really quickly and easily. And he thinks that the American Civil War losers would have been treated much worse than what actually happened at the end of the American Civil War. Really interesting stuff. I think I'm actually going to have to stop here for now, though, because this is actually quite a long video. This is a lot of fun for me, I gotta say, especially as an American from my point of view. This is really, really interesting to think about. Oh my god, and this very well just all could have happened. That's the crazy thing. It really could have gone this way. Easily. So I think I'm going to stop here for now, but if you've enjoyed this so far, feel free to give this video a like or leave a comment with your thoughts on any of this stuff. That'd be very interesting to hear about. And if you're interested in part 2 of this, where I'll finish this video, or if you're interested in more videos like this, me reacting to Britain and British culture, and stuff about Britain I've never seen or learned before, feel free to subscribe for more. And until then, thanks for watching, and see you next time.